everyone. I hope each of you are well. I am here to give a lecture about Module 10. So let's jump into Module 10 and see what that has in store for us. And you'll see that our topic for this week is evidence-based practices and assessments using a multicultural lens. This chapter, and I would say please read this. There are some significant instructions for your semester projects in Module 9. Please go and consult Module 9 for specific information about completing your semester projects. That's really important, and that's why I left this on the screen. So, looking at our course and an overview of this week. Evidence-based practices and assessments become a little bit problematic. And here you see an intersection of modernity and postmodernity for those bigger ideas that we were talking about early on in the class. It becomes very evident here. And so if you remember about modernity, when philosophy, science, even religion they're interested in the one right answer, the one size fits all, I've got the objective truth, here it is. I would argue that evidence-based practices lean heavily into that tradition. I would also, from my perspective, offer that early in my career, from 2004 to 2000, well, as a counselor, I would say up until 2015, these evidence-based practices were vigorously promoted, particularly here in Oklahoma. And so the idea behind really promoting evidence-based practices is to lean into science. And so psychology is a field of science, counseling is a field that needs to rely upon science. And so when I say the term evidence-based practices, that is referring to, okay, there are studies published that show efficacy for this treatment modality. This style of treatment makes a difference and leads to improvement. And so when you hear the term evidence-based practice, think, okay, this is something that has been scientifically shown, empirically shown to be effective. I'm going to take you through a few of these that I actually have been trained in, because again, there was a big push to, okay, let's make sure that our clinicians are trained in evidence-based practices so people get better. It's a noble idea, right? So there are quite a few. This isn't an exhaustive list, but this is definitely the ones that I've spent some time being trained and trained as a supervisor in. So this one is called MET CBT-5, Motivational Enhancement Therapy, Cognitive Behavioral Therapy 5. The 5 stands for the number of sessions that are required. And so there are 2 individual sessions and 3 in group. This is a modality shown to be effective for treating adolescents with cannabis use disorders. So I was trained and supervised in that. I've also been trained in this manualized approach. This is called Seeking Safety. It concurrently treats addiction and trauma. And the author, Lisa Najovitz, has a lot of publications on its efficacy, even across different cultures. I'd say she definitely took time to demonstrate that. Here's another one. This is called the Adolescent Community Reinforcement Approach. This is heavy behaviorism, really heavy behaviorism with maybe cognitive a small c. Like if you're thinking CBT, think lowercase c, capital B for a cognitive behavioral approach. This is very manualized. You'll see there are a lot of pages in each one of these. And when I say manualized, these are the manuals to be able to deliver those approaches. So you go to let's a 3 day training or maybe a week long training in some respects. You get supervision, you record yourself, a supervisor training that gives you feedback, and therefore you become certified in these different evidence-based treatment approaches. There are other approaches out there. I mean, a popular one now is EMDR, and a lot of clinicians are trained in EMDR because it has shown efficacy in treating trauma. And another one that I'm trained in, and I have a class that was built around largely, is the Overcoming Child Trauma class. This is the textbook that is one of the textbooks that are required for the class, and this is TFCBT. If you read your textbook, your chapters 9 and 11, you'll know that in one portion of your textbook, the authors cite TFCBT as being modified to be culturally and multiculturally responsive. And so you're like, fantastic, man, this is great. You have all this training, this knowledge, this evidence. And these, again, a lot of my career from, I'd say 2006 to 2015 was the time period when I'm learning those things. Um, and it's again, you want to do things that, science has shown to be effective. One of the problems with this is in science. So if you think about the scientific method and you think about you took research methodology, and if you're an undergraduate, went through a bachelor's of science in psychology, you really want to try to control for variables, right? You really want this replicability. You really want to show consistency. You want to show, that something that, like a methodology in a study, you want to be able to replicate that. And so what studies tend to do is, well, we rely a lot on, okay, what's the most convenient cost and time saving sample that I can come up with? And so oftentimes in science, there are significant limitations in how much you can generalize, think about external validity, how much you can generalize the results of a study to other populations, uh, other cultures. In our scientific literature, it's overwhelmingly historically represented by white Anglo-Saxon Protestant North American college students oftentimes. Uh, and therefore other voices are excluded from the results. And what you can see, so taking this in two halves here, taking this first from evidence-based practices, and then also we're going to apply it in the second part of the lecture to assessments. What you have then are these methods, and I would say this one really heavily, like, so sometimes I'll say this, not all EBPs are created equal. Some EBPs have evidence-based practices have greater flexibility written into the design. This one is not. This one, I took a team of youth and family counselors to get trained in this, and there was significant pushback because it was like you read the manual, you do exactly as it says in the process, in procedurally the way it says, using the same words that it's written in. And so there for a practicing clinician, there was significant pushback, like this isn't going to work with so and so. This isn't going to work with this and that. Um, ACRA has some really good things, and I would say that as a clinician, the ACRA authors will come and punch me in the face and say, you can't say that you're doing ACRA. ACRA borrows heavily on CBT. I've been trained in cognitive behavioral therapy. And so I've used components of ACRA. I didn't claim that I was using ACRA, but I've used components of it because, heck, I was trained in these things to deliver them, but I modified them to fit my audience. And so if you read and you kind of read between the lines, and this didn't show up very well, And I think I have a better picture, a better rendition of this actually here. So if you are, come on, if you're thinking about, okay, well, how do I deliver? I've been trained in this. How do I deliver an evidence-based approach? Ah, it didn't show up, did it? That's unfortunate. The diagram, the Venn diagram that I'm trying to reference, is actually a part of your textbook. And this computer does not deal with high RAM usage very well. So I apologize if this is glitchy. Um, but what you're actually trying to do then, and this comes from Norcross and others, 2010. Again, that's you can reference that in your textbook. What's the best available research? Thinking about my client, what is their background, their culture, maybe their cognitive ability? What are their preferences for treatment? Do they want to come to 16 weeks of therapy in this and be involved with their parents? There's a parent component to this too. Are the parents available? And how can I also apply my clinical expertise? What else do I have that I can offer to make this treatment approach faithful to science, if possible, but also faithful to a patient's culture? And that's where replicability then becomes difficult if you're trying to do studies in outpatient populations, as far as efficacy of practice. Um, this is again, this is where kind of both ideas of like modernity and postmodernity come together. Uh, you're welcome to go through here, and here's my lecture. Sorry, I was not following lecture because I was trying to give you the like, what is evidence-based practice? What are we talking about here? You can go through and you can click on these things. Evidence-based practice is, I hesitate to say under assault, but I also don't want to not use those terms. In 2018, the National Registry for Evidence-Based Programs, the NREP, and your textbook mentions the NREP. What this was, it was a registry where you could go that the government, the United States government, agreed upon, like, hey, this has enough literature that mental health clinicians, psychologists, people need to be able to go and reference this to see, hey, I have a client that's presenting with depression. What are the main modalities that are effective? And so they would post these things. I have a client with significant symptoms of PTSD. What are some approaches that are going to be? And so this was publicly available. And for whatever reasons, you can, fill in the blanks there with your own ideas and do your own research because this is not the place for this. Removed the National Registry in 2018, which is unfortunate. They're like, and I would go as a supervisor, and I would go and reference to help people, to help like because I'm supervising clinician. I've supervised over 30 clinicians toward licensure in my career. When I was at Youth and Family for 8 years, there were 75 different people that I supervised clinically in that capacity. And so I wanted again to give resources. That was removed in 2018. From 2000, so you can click on these and they'll take you to some links that still exist. However, I will say that if you click on these and try to go, some of the links have been dismantled, and I would argue these have been dismantled since 2025. There are some things that still exist. I do know that there were certain words that were punched in and and then removed from government sites uh, for whatever reasons. And I don't have a before and after sample to say what happened to these the some of the resources, but I can say there are a lot of empty links that if you go to this now, it looks like the SAMHSA and the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, did try to re-establish these between the years of 2021 and 2024. But I can tell you that there appear to be some things missing as of this year when I went through and tried to find them. There are some broken links, some things don't appear, and that's unfortunate. This was very helpful in a world where counselors typically are underpaid for what they do and don't have resources. This was a nice resource to have for quite a number of years. Okay, let's move on to the next bullet point here. So there is some tension between evidence-based practices and authenticity. What I mean by that is when you go to these trainings, whether it's for TFCBT, whether it's for seeking safety, whether it's for ACRA, whether it's 100 different trainings that you could go to that are evidence-based practice manualized. When you do it the first couple of times, it feels very contrived. It feels very staccato. It feels very disjointed. And until you get attuned to it, it doesn't feel natural. And so we do know from research that if you're not authentic, if your client doesn't, perceive you to be authentic, that can be problematic. And in the efficacy of the treatment itself. In fact, your textbook it goes back and references some Wampold research that I point to that bigger study from 2001, 2015 that, hey, these common factors are important about, if we're going to elicit change in our clients. It's a real thing. And so not just, I would say, even as you learn, there's some problems there, but specifically if you're trying to reach a particular population, please pay attention to your textbooks when it's talking, and I would say even in the video, you've witnessed some microaggressions. There's some stats in there about even if you try to apply an evidence-based model, maybe there's some inherent microaggressions built in. So that's where it's important to, take that approach as, okay, how can I combine, my expertise with the client with what I know about this practice? So that this is the sweet spot that we're the Goldilocks zone that we're shooting for when we're talking about evidence-based practices. And so there is some tension. There is some tension between authenticity, and there's often tension between EBPs and culturally competent care because of how the studies have been produced. Not always, but oftentimes. And so now let's converge over to assessments. And this is the video. This is the discussion board actually has to do with the use of assessments in particular. And there are so for those of you taking the comprehensive exam, I can tell you that there are some questions, maybe a couple about, responsible use of assessments and making sure you are taking into consideration how those assessments were normed. And so assessments should really, if we're talking about psychology, should look for their validity here, which is the DSM-5 TR, correct? This is our current edition, most current rendition of diagnostic statistical manual for disorders. So most assessments, well, most, I hesitate to use all-encompassing terms, absolutistic terms, but all assessments that look for, to measure disorders should go here for reference. If you look at the way this book was produced, and if you take the DSM class with me, it's a week-long thing at the second week of May. We take a really quick but deep dive into how do you make responsible diagnoses. We also cover on the first day where this came from. And so this book it's not produced a priori without, this broader context that we live in influencing it. Particularly, the first couple of renditions of the DSM are largely reflective of Judeo-Christian values, but also psychodynamic theory, which, think Freud, think that, most psychiatrists, and this was originally put together by psychiatrists. In fact, it's the American Psychiatry Association, not the Psychological Association, that publishes this book. So you're like, okay, you're going over a lot of history. I know, I know. This, you'll see it's a lot thicker. If you look at the first like edition, it's not, I don't think it's 100 pages, maybe 100. This is verging on like 1,000. This is 1,000 pages. So, 10 times bigger. Definitely looking at things a little differently. What you'll notice between the DSM-4 and definitely DSM-5 TR is a much, again, that modernity versus post-modernity, a recognition that the culture of your client is, I don't want to use the word supremely important, but I'll use significantly, at risk of overusing a term, significantly of significant importance when considering a diagnosis. And for each one of these, there's a cultural considerations like tab that you go through. Again, this is our attempts in the psychological science to move away from an absolutistic label and to more appropriately uh, set the stage for uh, honoring other cultures. Think about the word humility we started with. That's not something that you think a lot of, with science is having humility, but that's really where we're going with this. With that in mind, even thinking a bigger context, there's a couple of forces working against science here. One force is, uh, I would argue, an anti-intellectual force, which is we're not going to accept this anymore. You're not an authority. You're asking us to do things we're not comfortable with. There's a pushback from a space of ignorance. But there's also a pushback internally from science, or a pullback, which is, oh gosh, maybe we've done some damage. We need to pull back and we need to be a little more conservative. So if you think about those two forces working over and against science, I think you see that space now where you have national organizations that are, being undermined by larger systemic forces. Anyway, I know that I get heady sometimes. Those of you that are tracking, I appreciate you tracking with it. Here's the important facts. Assessments. Assessments are at the mercy of science. They're at the mercy of the replicable or the studies that they've done, which are trying to be replicable and trying to establish validity, in and of themselves. And so there's some limitations with oftentimes with the groups that are sampled. So if you're in the counseling business, if you're trying to go be a counselor, Oklahoma, the state licensure board mandates that you take 2 classes from a program. It's in their language, like what's an acceptable program. You have to take 2 classes in assessment. So in our program, we have stats for assessment, and we also have the other assessments class where it's hands-on, and you actually deliver like intelligence tests, personality tests, those kind of things. So we have 2 classes for assessment. So it's an important thing. We want you to be able to lean into the science. Oklahoma wants you to lean into the science. But when you do lean into the science, I want you to use, and I think from this class, it's important to say, okay, what's the research say? What are the studies that it normed? So you'll have a norming study where you norm an instrument. How was this instrument and what population do they use to norm its dimensions, its sensitivity, how did they validate the instrument? And you have to look at that. And then you look at your patient characteristics, the culture your patient's coming from, also their preferences, but also your expertise. Your textbook does a good job of delving into this. I'd also pay a lot of attention to the video that I am requiring that you all reflect on. So this is your assignment then at the end is read through chapters 9, 11. Watch this, which is it went on longer than I wanted to, but it's normally me. What are your feelings as you watch this video here? Not me, but the one I'm pointing to on the screen. What are your thoughts about implementing evidence-based practices and also giving assessments from multiculturally aware and responsible perspective? What challenges might you face? And then how might you overcome or work through these? That's your work, gang. That's what I'm asking you to do. I hope this has been informative. I know sometimes I get heady, but I hope you followed too, because it's not something that I don't I recognize I'm not in a box. There are bigger things that influence what we do. So take care. Please reach out if you have any questions, and I look forward to reading your responses.